here's the challenge. Usually transitions, they happen within unknowns for which we don't have yet a language. So how can we speak the unspeakable? How can we navigate what we do not know yet?
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Celiane Camargo-Borges as we take a communication perspective on designing complex conversations. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Celiane Camargo-Borges. Celiane is an intercultural explorer, researcher, and facilitator. She has a passion for fostering collaboration across diverse communities. She was born and raised in Brazil, has lived in many places, and finally is now settled in the Netherlands. She's a faculty member at Brady University of Applied Sciences and a consultant at Designing Conversations. You can check out more from her in the show notes, and of course, you'll hear about her straight from her in just a moment. I've really loved listening back to this conversation, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I have. I think there's a lot of really great, complex, juicy stuff to chew on in this conversation. So I'm just so grateful to have Celiane as a conversation partner, thinking through things like how we know what we know, how we can reimagine and create new possibilities for ourselves, and how social construction acts as a bridge between things like intent and impact. So just a lot of great things to hold on to from this conversation today. I won't tease you any longer. Let's jump right into it with Celiane. Hello, Celiane. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Hello there. Thank you for having me today. Very exciting.
I'm very excited as well. I'll start us off with the question, how are we arriving? I just love this question for setting some context. Before I even ask you to introduce yourself, I'll get to know a little about you. We'll get to know a little about you and kind of what you're bringing with you into the conversation this week. I'll give you another second to think about that question and go ahead and answer for myself. One thing that is at the front of mind for me this week is that I'm feeling very aware of the kind of difference in how I'm approaching these podcast conversations compared to my very early days of doing this podcast. I shared with you before we started recording that I was on another podcast this past weekend and recorded that, a newer podcast. And I just felt so much recognition in seeing the way they were putting things together and navigating things on the spot of, oh, yes, that's what it's like to be a new podcast host and be really trying to figure out as you go what works for you, because there's, maybe some standard things. If, you want a good quality mic and you want your headphones and what platform are you using to record and on. But it is something you really have to navigate for yourself. What works for you. This podcast was very different than mine. They record in a coffee shop and, cover very different topics. And so the prep for that and the actual recording of that looks very different. So I am feeling, I think, pretty proud of myself and thinking about where I've been and where I'm at now in terms of how I prepare for these. And more truthfully, I prepare, quote, prepare, I guess, in quotes, much less. I plan much less, actually. I'm still very prepared for the conversations, but try to do that in a more emerging way. Early days, I would send people like 10 questions ahead of time, which is way too many for an hour-long conversation. But I was really trying to create structure and plan how the conversation was going to go, because I wasn't at that point as confident in my improvisational abilities to really, I think, be as present in the conversation. So I hope that I can bring that to this conversation, and I feel like I will, because it's something that's become a lot more natural for me. So although I don't know everywhere our conversation's going to go today, I feel very confident in us as conversation partners and looking forward to what we'll create.
This is great. And as I'm sharing with you how I'm arriving here, I also want to comment on how you're arriving here. And I love what you're saying. And to me, this is how we embody our practice and knowledge over time. And I always say that this is something to look forward to getting older. The more we do something and we do mindfully, we start embodying it. And it becomes kind of an intuition in how we do it. So we are more comfortable in these unknown spaces of relating, right? So I love what you're bringing today. I'm arriving quite fresh. I spent my last month in Australia doing a field research with 45 master students. It was busy, but also very exciting to see them learning how to do research, how to be in a different place and understanding different perspectives and framing good questions. So I just arrived this weekend, and I live in Amsterdam, and this weekend was a very sunny weekend. And for us in the global north, it's quite special when the sun comes out in the winter. So it's been really amazing to have some warmth and have some rest in the weekend. So I feel pretty ready for our conversation now.
That must be a Netherlands-wide experience, because I recorded with two people yesterday that are also in the Netherlands, and they spoke about getting to go on walks again and being outside in the sun. And I'm experiencing some of that too in Indiana. So yeah, I know what a good effect that sun can have as you emerge from the cold winter.
Exactly. And as a Brazilian, I always say I'm testing my tropical blood in this cold, windy country.
Yes.
So it's always a present when there is some warmth and sun. And spring coming up is my favorite season. It's when everyone is so tired of the winter, and all of a sudden hope is back.
Yep.
People are smiling again, taking the walks, and the flowers are blooming. So it's quite a nice moment to be in the Netherlands.
Yeah. I know people, kind of roll their eyes or joke, oh, let's talk about the weather, as like small talk at the beginning of a conversation. But especially this, and that's very possible. But I think especially in this kind of moment, like this is the way we're using it right now, at least, is not small talk about the weather, but a real acknowledgement of when the sun is out, when I can go outside, when I can feel reconnected with nature. Like those are real things that are shaping how you're arriving right now.
Exactly.
Well, Celiane, thank you so much for indulging me in that question. And to move into the rest of the conversation, could you keep introducing yourself? Tell us a little more about you and what feels important to you that we know about you as we go into this conversation.
I would start by saying I'm a Brazilian living in the Netherlands, as I was telling you, and I have lived before in Asia for a while. I lived in Taiwan, in Singapore. I did part of my PhD in the United States. So I could say that I'm an international or intercultural professional. So whatever I'm doing, I'm always with these glasses on, paying attention at context and culture and perspectives. And I love to embrace all these elements in what I'm doing. My first background is in psychology, and I have done my master's in social psychology and my PhD in public health. And a portion of my PhD, when I was living in the United States at the University of New Hampshire, having Sheila McNamee as my supervisor, I was at the communication department. So the whole communication approach really shaped my way of working and my way of being and becoming this psychologist who mixed with healthcare and all. Now I'm at a university in the Netherlands within the Faculty of Tourism and Leisure, which also takes these elements of culture and art. So I would say that I'm also interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary professional. So I try to blurry the disciplinary mode. So kind of merge a little bit knowledges.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to start. And yeah, good to name that Sheila McNamee is our connection. And so I already knew you to be rooted in social constructionism. And so I'm curious kind of where that entered your story. Was it when you came to the United States and met Sheila that you first learned of social construction? Were you already practicing it and that's what brought you here? So I guess a kind of two-parted question of when did you first encounter social construction and what was so compelling about it to you?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's been quite a while ago, but it's quite an interesting story because Sheila McNamee is quite the center of my encounter with social construction. And back then, I was doing my master's in Brazil at the University of São Paulo, and we had this research group exploring concepts, theories, and approaches to work with our topics. And we bump into social construction, and we were quite fascinated by the idea, well, the central idea of social construction, which is we construct our realities in our coordinations, in our relationships with each other. And that was quite a turning point in my academic life, because in conventional science and research, we see knowledge as something that is out there waiting to be discovered. And by using the right methodology, you have your research done. And then with social construction, we start seeing that, well, knowledge is actually created by us, and the methodologies are also developments by school of thoughts. And we wanted to know more about that. And we start digging into the core authors in social construction and reading all these papers. So we decided to write to a couple of scholars. And Sheila McNamee was the first one to respond. And actually, she responded quite quickly. And being who she is, in the first email, she was already inviting us, oh, just come and study with me. You are welcome. And we were like, wow, this professor doesn't know us, and she's already invited us to come. So it was kind of love at first sight. So my colleagues, my research mates who were a little bit ahead of me in their process, they were the first one to go to New Hampshire and stay there with Sheila. And then afterwards, we invited Sheila to go to Brazil, and I ended up spending 1 year there with her during my PhD. And the rest is history. We have been having this back and forth with Brazilian students and researchers going to Sheila and Sheila coming to us in Brazil. So that was my first encounter. And after my PhD, I was invited to be an associate at the Taos Institute. And I started working with the community. And the past 7 years, I've been sitting in the board of Taos. So I had the opportunity to work with the board as a board member. And just a couple of months ago, I just stepped out after 7 years to refresh myself a little bit. And just to share something, we have this newsletter of the Taos community. And just this month, we published a little news about revamping the Taos Institute Europe. So we are busy right now in creating a movement in Europe to exercise again, coming together and share constructionist ideas in the global north.
Well, thanks for sharing that story and answering that question. It feels that's kind of a question I ask of people who come on who specifically have a communication background is usually how I ask it, because I'm always so curious, like, how'd you get into this in the first place and what kind of keeps you, interested or curious about communication. And I think it feels important for me to ask that, not only because I just, love to hear people's stories, but also because not everyone that comes on the podcast has the shared framework of social construction or CMM or communication even. And so for the people that do, it feels really important for me to not take for granted that, oh, we have a shared framework, we're making the same meaning out of it, or we have the same experience or the same pieces of it resonate with us. And so it feels very important for me to kind of clarify that, to not make an assumption about how we're making meaning, very, very CMM-ish, very social construction, to ask a question like that.
Yeah.
Well, Celiane, I also wonder if you could go back a little more, because again, I love to hear the stories. I wonder if you could point to any stories or experiences that were maybe more early days that you feel like led you to want to get you to where you started with psychology and kind of kept you on the path you went from there. What got you into that in the first place? What are the kind of maybe experiences you had in your life that led you there?
I would say I have always been a curious person, and I have been curious about how people are the way they are.
Mhm.
And always I've been very curious in understanding what I like and my choices. Are they really my choices?
Mhm.
Or I was programmed to be liking that way and acting that way. And this is always a tricky question. And I thought maybe if I go and study psychology and start reading about, the nature of human behavior and the minds, I might be responding this question to myself. And I think that was my first impulse to do psychology, and I was 17-year old. So yeah, you don't know much about what you want to do for the rest of your life. And so you make some choices in a more naive way, but I really fell in love um, with the field. And I have been, in this quest of how do we understand the complexity of who we are and who we are becoming. And also, again, with social construction, the idea that we are not one single self, possessed
Mhm.
with a personality and this self-contained individual, but we are a combination of multiple selves and multiple beings. And I think that really helps me to understand myself and also to make sense of the surroundings of how people are and the variety of ways they behave. And now, lately I have been working with designing conversations, which conversations pretty much come from communication, like looking at language not just as a tool, but the foundation of who we are and how we change. So by designing conversations, by asking certain questions, we are already inviting people to create
Mhm.
conversations and stories of what's possible, and
Mhm.
to reimagine. Even sometimes we think it's not possible, but like, can we reimagine new ways of doing things? So I think psychology really opened the door, and then I kept unfolding and creating, bringing more resources that could complement
Mhm.
psychology. So that's why I was saying about blurring disciplines, because I think, especially nowadays that we are facing all these complex crises, or like we live in these urgent times
Mhm.
where, yeah, we are searching for new ways to inhabit this planet. And I think one single discipline is not giving answers anymore. So we really
Yeah,
need
yeah.
to come together as a collective.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And as you're, kind of trying to describe this complex crisis, you just said the word that came to my mind that I've learned in the past couple months, I would say, is polycrisis. And that
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense to me, that it almost in the same way that you're saying, one discipline, it's, really rich or more beneficial, or there's so much to learn if we talk about multiple disciplines in the same conversation and kind of combine multiple perspectives as a response to something that is very complex, something that I'm naming the polycrisis right here, and saying that we can't just talk about one crisis at a time because they don't exist independently of each other. And so it kind of makes sense that like the response needs to mirror the problem that you're facing, to say, well, you can't talk about, you can, but you know, you can talk about communication without talking about psychology, but then you're missing the interplay between those two things. Or like the podcast that I just recorded was with two people that work with the polyvagal theory. And so that's about the nervous system and your kind of physical presence. And so we talk about communication in terms of how are you communicating with your body and what's your body communicating to you? And so it's like, that's another really interesting, you know, intersection of looking at things that does feel very important.
Yeah, fascinating. And yet our default mode, like our Western way of living, is pretty much focused on these silos, right? And also being very fast in finding solutions. And when we see this systemic and this complex polycrisis, we see like it's not about finding a solution or fixing something that's broken, it's reinventing everything, right? It's recreating a way of living.
Yeah, I want to pull up a note that I made to myself as I was reading something yesterday. Kim Pierce, who's the president of the CMM Institute, gave me this paper that Barnett Pierce wrote in, I don't actually know when it's from, but a long time ago. And I don't even know if this is a paper that's online anywhere. She gave me like, I forgot, like a physical copy that was like written on a typewriter. It's you know, from that era, to give you some context. And there was a quote in it that Barnett wrote that I think this was his kind of paraphrasing of a different quote that he had quoted. Nothing exists that we can know independently of our process of knowing, and that process affects that which is known. And just earlier when you were speaking about what kind of first grabbed you about social construction, that quote came to mind. And I feel so curious about that. And I think where it's kind of leading me is that I kind of maybe, it's not jumping to a conclusion because it is within the language of CMM and social construction to talk about the kind of looking forward piece of, okay, what new choices are we going to make? What new stories are we going to tell? How, you know, orienting toward better social worlds, and kind of this like looking forward with, if you, you know, have the assumption that we have choices and we're the active participants and looking forward. But this is kind of making me want to like pause in this moment of, before you jump into, well, what do we do with that choice? Or what do we do with that role as a participant? I'm curious just to spend a little more time, another moment, in just the truth or the belief of that, and what kind of that means for us.
Yeah. And I'm having this feeling, but also experiencing that more and more this approach, the CMM, the constructionist approach, it's so much needed and slowly start making sense elsewhere. I remember in the beginning of my career when I was studying that, I never forget my master's defense. I mean, I spent the whole defense trying to justify why constructionist approaches, how can I say that? How my framework, my constructionist framework was rigorous enough to be a research. And so it was really hard to challenge the idea of stability and replicability, and trying to show here I'm talking about a different epistemology, I'm talking about a different way of understanding knowledge. But now more and more people are getting it, because that's the quest. We need to engage more with this non-foundational understanding of what reality is. Reality is here, it's strong, we can see, we can touch, but it's not independent from what we are doing and creating all the time.
Yeah, it feels very compelling, feels like very important. It feels like people are getting it more. I agree that there's that interplay between, you know, the kind of the quote that I just read, the act of knowing and what is known. and it's all interrelated. Anyway, these are just big ideas floating around in my head right now for me. But I do want to get back to language that you just used, that is designing conversations. And this is another one of those moments where I'm really curious to know what that means to you, because I just this past October was able to go to a systemic design conference, and that was my first my first conference and my first kind of glimpse into the world of systemic design and systems thinking. And that's another one of those, I think, really beautiful intersections of like CMM, social construction, and systems thinking. And so it just has me thinking about design. And, like I shared earlier, going into these conversations, I, in the early days had the impulse or the instinct to over prepare and over plan. And the conversations I was designing were probably more coming from a space of like, I really need to control this because I came from a good place of like, I want to create a great podcast. But now over time, my understanding of what makes a good podcast has changed. And so when I'm thinking kind of intentionally about what I want to create, my design of the conversation has become so much less about content or output or outcome, and so much more about process. I feel like what I'm designing is the process. And so that's kind of where I'm coming into this conversation with. And I'm curious to know what you mean when you talk about designing conversations, and really, what does that look like?
Yeah, interesting. So designing conversations, this is a concept or a way of working, researching, intervening that I have been talking about. That's actually a combination of two meaningful encounters I had in life, which is one is with the social construction approach, and the other one is the design thinking approach.
Mm-hmm.
And slowly, as we are embodying our knowledge, it became more clear, intentional, and intuitive, combining them. Because when we are talking about designing, and could be design of stuff, chairs and tables, or it could be designing of processes, but in the design field, professionals are quite explicitly intentional about what they want to create, and they use artifacts to create that. And they
What do you mean by that? Like, what's an artifact?
I would, for example, if you are creating a session with people in which you want them to talk about a certain topic, design thinkers intentionally will think of a prop, something concrete, tangible that invites people to talk. It could be a dance, it could be a ball. And from the constructionist perspective, I love to bring language. So that's also my combination. So when I bring metaphors create a different invitation for people to talk. Storytelling, inviting people to bring stories instead of instead of asking a rational question on a topic. Also drawing or make interpretations of pictures. So these are props that are artifacts that can help you creating things. However, sometimes designers, they are creative, but if you ask them what is behind this creativity, I feel like there's something missing, which to me is like the whole social construction approach of it. You are not just being creative for the fun of it or to create a nice environment. You are being creative because creativity is in itself brings a novelty in any topic. You are actively creating new possibilities, or how Ken Gergen used to say, forming futures.
Yeah.
You are opening the possibility to form new futures by embracing in the present intentional tools, intentional invitations. And so it's pretty much about creating new realities. And design thinkers, they don't necessarily think about it. They are good in having creative tools to bring people together for co-create on a topic. Social constructionists, sometimes they lack the creative tools. They're pretty much engaged in the whole conceptualization of what it is. But then how do you do that? Sometimes people get stuck. Okay, I understand that language is not just a tool, language is action. How do I do that? So when you merge design thinking with social construction, then you have a framework in which you can actively design spaces and places for people to come together. And thinking even about the invisible design. How do you place together the chairs around this conversation? Are you making rows of chairs where people face each other's back, as we have in traditional classrooms, or you're making circle of chairs where conversations become more interactive? This is all designing of spaces. So then you can do that more intentionally, and also with the constructionism, being very mindful in the language, in the words you are choosing, and in the questions you are inviting people to talk. So this combination is also, I just published a book together with Sheila McNamee where we call that the constructionist design framework. So we try to make it as a guideline to offer people, like, there are simple ways of doing that. It shouldn't be too mystical, like people, wow, how do you make this happen? Well, there are some preparation that you can embrace that helps you in creating this environment for engagement, for, as Sheila likes to say, this radical presence, being mindful of this process of relating in conversations. I don't know if I made it too complicated.
No. No, it's perfect. You're making me think so many things. I love this. And I just want to call out that I think kind of implied in the way both of us are using design conversations is kind of like designing effective conversations, designing meaningful conversations, or like helpful design. I don't want to say like good, because it's not as simple as good or bad, but I'm just kind of aware that there's, probably plenty of people out there that design things that a social constructionist perspective would be like, ooh, that's not what I would do. And so I was so curious, like, what are the things that make, again, I don't want to say good design, but maybe you have language for this. Like, what's impactful design? Like, what's that differentiation that we haven't kind of made yet?
Yeah, good question. What would make a good design? So in the framework we created, the framework is made of 4 steps. And the first step, which is collaborative co-creation, I would say a good design is when you spend enough time in the preparation of whatever you're doing. And we underestimate the power of preparing in the sense of making sure who are the people you are inviting? Why are you inviting these people? What kind of voices they're bringing? Are there some silenced voices that should be in that you are overlooking? And then how do you make the invitation in such a way that's powerful enough that these people feel they belong to this conversation? And then how do you frame your questions? What kind of invitations you are making for the conversations? And then again, as we said, the invisible design, where is the place you are inviting people to come to? So all this preparation is already, I think, a big portion of a good design process. And then before you come into the actual and the real intervention or the real research, in this preparation where you are doing the co-creation part, you want to expand your understanding on the topic, because you might have a topic to work with, you might have this interest, but you don't know what is, as we say, the problem behind the problem. You don't know enough until you come to the context and to the people you might be working with. So then when you share with people this topic and get from them their own perspective, you expand your understanding, and you also increase the possibility to address better your research or your intervention. So I think that makes a good design process, because you start already knowing better your people, your topic, the environment, and the context. I think this is one element that I would say quite fundamental, quite crucial.
Yeah. I have some thoughts, but I also want to give you the chance. Would you name those other 3 pieces of the approach?
Yeah. So the first phase is collaborative co-creation. And it's pretty much about appreciating your topic. And appreciating, I mean, understand better and looking at all these perspectives, and also connect better to the people and to the topic. And then when you have that, you can kind of map the system in a way that you see the interconnections of all these perspectives. Sometimes they are very contradictory, but this is real life. Like, let's embrace the diversity, the contradictions. And then you start playing with framing and reframing this topic, which is the second phase that we call generative research questions. So in defining and reframing your questions based on this mapping that you do from the first phase, you can have better questions that are more connected to the topic. And then you can move to, what we call data generation. So it's not about collecting data, but it's generating new information and making meaning of this information. In design thinking, we call ideate and prototype. So as you are co-creating this information and this data and making meaning, you are already moving to the direction of having some ideas for action. And then when you have some ideas for action, then you get into this final phase, which is about forming futures. So in this phase, you start experimenting and implementing with your idea. The point of this final phase is pretty much inviting professionals and invite people to act upon their ideas. Don't stop just with the framing and the vision of this future. Try to play with, experiment. And then from this experimentation, you kind of start again, okay, I see that these ideas and this experimentation make sense. So you can start structuring better, maybe a bigger action or creating a bigger project. But we don't start from the big business plan of change, but we start very small, and by experimenting, we implement slowly, and then it grows. Expands.
I have some language that I'm curious about, because as you're talking, the more I think about design, I'm seeing that as kind of implying or requiring or meaning that there's a certain intentionality, just like if you're using design thinking, then you're saying we're being intentional upfront about all of these things. And then that's kind of leading me into this language that's familiar to me from a completely other space of, I don't know if you'd be familiar with, people talk about intent versus impact. And I think I first heard that language, I worked as a resident assistant at my college. And so we would put on different events, have different conversations. And so I think I first heard it, and maybe it was even in a class, heard it around conversations of like social justice and like anti-racist work, to talk about like the things you say, there's a difference between the intent it has. Maybe you're trying to be curious, but maybe the impact it has is that it feels hurtful to someone else. And so that's kind of been language that stuck with me and has kind of traveled even outside that space. Like, I think I offered that language to my dad a couple of years ago. And I was like, hey, your intent is you're, trying to take care of me because you're my dad. And that's what this means to you. But the impact it's having on me is I feel like you're trying to fix my problems and I just want you to listen to me, or, I'm feeling controlled. And so I'm kind of curious about that language in this moment as it applies to designing conversations, that you're being intentional up front. And I'm almost seeing like social construction as a bridge between intent and impact, because I think what you're talking about requires intention up front. And it also requires a really good understanding of the potential impact. And so that's that, what are we creating kind of question that emerges in CMM and social construction, because you can have all the intent, all the best intent, but if you're not in conversation with the impact piece and what it actually means to people and what it actually does and what it makes, then your, intent is kind of like, that's really only half the conversation.
I love your question. This is so fundamental here. And I would say, and especially in research, conventional research really creates this idea of the neutral and objective researcher, right? So the researchers, they come with their methodologies and they are neutral, objective. They're just testing their hypothesis and everything. And I would say that with this approach, the intention and the intentionality, it's pretty much being mindful and open of your biases. So traditional research tries to get rid of biases as much as possible.
Yeah, right.
And I would say in the constructionist design framework, that when you're doing research, you try to take advantage of your bias. So you think about it. You take your positionality to reflect upon where you come from. What are your intentions? Why is this topic important to you? And in this first phase, the collaborative co-creation, when you are trying to appreciate and understand the topic, who are the other players on this topic? And what are their intentionality? What are their perspectives? So in that sense, we also work with this ethics of care. Like, is this important to whom? And who are the people with the voice and the power to talk about it? And what are the others that don't have, and we need to bring them into the room? So to make it as complex and complicated as possible, before you even frame your final questions, in order to make sure your intent might have an impact and a good impact for the people living with that topic in that context. So at the end of the day, it's interesting because as a researcher, it is about you, but it's not about you. It is about you in the sense of you are proposing this research. So it's your responsibility to open up your bias, your positionality, your intersectionality, and expand the perspectives, especially because it's also not about you. It's about the collective and environment in which you are intervening and research about.
You've just like opened up so much for me in your description of that. And it's, kind of taking us back to how we know what we know and that process of knowing and how we're engaged in that. And wow, yeah, I just think that makes so much sense because I've really come to conceptualize what a communication perspective offers us as compared to what maybe some of our defaults, instincts, internalized stories are, that I think there's such a strong impulse to, when you come across something that feels very complex, I think there's a strong instinct to want to simplify it.
Yeah.
And I think what a communication perspective and what, because my work is about trying to further the kind of practical application side of CMM, that, hey, there's really great tools, there's really great language, very important, that can actually be used in our lives, that we can actually put into place. And so to me, CMM is saying, hey, when you encounter complexity, and you will, because we live in complex social worlds and communicating is really, really complex. When you encounter that, we are equipping you with the tools to navigate it and move through it rather than try to remove it. And so that's kind of what I'm hearing you say as well, that, and again, it makes sense that the kind of traditional approach to research would emerge out of what I've just kind of named as the kind of some of our default ways of being, that it's like, well, oh, we're coming up against complexity. Maybe I have bias in this moment. We're going to remove it or try to create a scenario where it doesn't exist. And I just think that's impossible.
Yeah.
You have to like cram down something big and complex into a simple little box. Like, I don't think that works. And I think the main part to me is that I don't think that really serves us. I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves by trying to make everything so simple.
Exactly. I totally agree. So the approach here is to make it as complex as possible.
Yeah.
And then be humble about it.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot solve all this complexity, but by acknowledging it, by acknowledging our biases, by revisiting our instincts, by revisiting the way we learn how to think, we give a space to reflect, to make changes. And also in the second phase of the framework, when we're talking about generative questions, it's also about being explicit, framing one question at a time, and being honest about it, for here and now. This is the question I'm exploring. I'm not trying to make it more simple, and I'm not trying to solve the whole system at once.
Yeah.
And so, I think this is a way to be more mindful, to be humble, and to be more ethical in the knowledge we are co-creating.
Well, I want to learn more from you about some language that you've offered me when we've spoken before, that some work that you've done is around sustainability transitions, which is not language that I'm familiar with, and that feels like that probably emerges out of designed conversations. And so as I think in our conversation, we're kind of getting to this natural point of like, okay, here's kind of two different, or there's many different ways of approaching communication. There's many different ways of designing, of being, of researching. And so what I feel so curious about is like, how does one make the jump from one to the other? Because not only is the content complex, I think the process of that is complex, and you kind of have to be dedicated to that and curious about it. And so I just am curious now to know what sustainability transitions are. And I guess I'll just start there. What's a sustainability transition?
Well, good question. I'm quite busy with that right now. So at my university, Breda University of Applied Sciences here in the Netherlands, I'm part of a research group called Transversal Sustainability Transitions, which is under the leadership of Professor Franz Melissen. And it's a quite new research group, and together we are investigating sustainability, but from a more systemic approach. So we are trying to see how sustainability can be understood and embraced from all this perspective we are talking so far. Especially because sustainability is also an approach that has been developed to address this crisis we are living nowadays, and how could we find solutions to our planet and create a better ways to live with nature, with other species. However, sustainability itself also comes from this Western traditional approach in which you find what is going wrong with the planet, you add your solution, and then you fix it. However, our research group is quite aligned with this growing movement of scholars and practitioners questioning this fundamental assumption that we cannot solve our problems with the same reasoning that has created. Right? And also the way we are responding to the crisis is the crisis in itself. So we need to change this. So we need a transition, right? So, and this transition, it's a shift in our way of thinking, of knowing, of acting. However, here's the challenge. Usually transitions, they happen within unknowns for which we don't have yet a language. So how can we speak the unspeakable? How can we navigate what we do not know yet? And this is a struggle, especially within environments, especially the academic environment, in which we are programmed to act upon what we know. Right? And then to make this shift, to make this transition, we need a completely different way of start thinking and acting. So we are quite busy with entertain ourselves with, okay, how do we do this transition from one way of living that clearly is not being doing good to the planet to a way of living that can be more aligned with a planet that can be healthy and stay longer livable for ourselves, for the other species. So I think that's where I bring my expertise of designing conversations. So how can we create space that could be kind of a safe space? You know, it is challenging. It needs to be provocative, but it should also be safe so people can embrace this unknown and experiment together to create this new language, to create, wording our world, create new worlds, right? Yeah, so there is one scholar that I like very much, Bayo Akomolafate. I don't know if you know him. He's a Nigerian thinker, also a poet. And he says, in order to find ourselves, we must first lose it generously. So, and losing it in the educational environment, we say we need to unlearn to learn again. It's really to make this shift on breaking the patterns that we are so used to think and to do, and start reinventing and recreating new ones. So I would say sustainability transitions begin with the way we relate to each other and we relate to the world around us. And relationships are built through conversations. So there we go again, back to the importance of conversations. So
it's inescapable.
Inescapable, right? So if we want to create a future within all these planetary boundaries that we're talking about, we need to start with the language we use, with the stories we tell, and how we are engaging in dialogue. So again, talking about future forming, there are plenty of professionals creating future scenarios of how the future will be. But here, when I'm talking about future forming, it's pretty much about forming a future in the present. So it is in what we are doing right now that we are forming our future. So we need to pay more attention in how, we are telling these stories and the choices we are making. So in our research group, we are trying to to create spaces in which we can do this future forming by being the present
Yes.
and telling stories and talking to each other and discovering each other again, rediscovering ourselves.
Wow. Well, I'm glad to hear you explain it that way. And a little bit relieved because I didn't want to have to put you on the spot, but I felt really curious about that language because for me on this podcast, I've been on my own little journey of kind of unlearning or deconstructing the assumption that sustainability is like this great goal, because that's the language. It's very much a buzzword, I would say, that's used at like sustainability, sustainability, sustainability. And in an earlier conversation on this podcast last year, probably right about this time, I think in April, I had a conversation with Abra Dresdale, and she offered me the language of regeneration. And I had not heard that yet. And so there's a couple other, this is going to be front of mind for people when they're listening to us, because I've had a couple other conversations this year about regeneration and kind of moving beyond sustainability. And so when I've, been thinking about sustainability transitions, I'm glad that you clarified what that means for you, because I was, kind of coming with that lens being like, but I'm learning about moving beyond sustainability, but that's also what you're offering, but just using that language of sustainability is kind of where you're coming from. And do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I would say I think the regenerative approach is pretty much aligned with the sustainability transitions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, in academia, you have these different languages and you have a group of scholars talking in their own way. But I think the idea is pretty much, to regenerate ourselves, the planet. And one of the first principles of regeneration and sustainability transitions is focusing on this multi-level perspective.
Yeah.
Also builds communities together.
Yeah. The other thing I want to pull out of what you've shared is, what you were saying right at the end about we use this language of futures, but how do we create that now? And that resonates so much for me about the language of better social worlds, because that language can feel like that's distant in the future. And that's really how I kind of used to think about it. And some of the questions I would ask about it on this podcast, even of, how are we moving towards that? Or what are we working towards? That kind of almost this like distance language.
Yeah.
And my thinking's really changed on that to want to know or be more curious about understanding better social worlds as like, what's the better social world of this moment?
Yeah.
Or the next couple moments, not just 10 years from now, what's your, better social world, but what's the better social world right now? And taking that social constructionist perspective, what do you create? How are you creating that again right now? Because John Burnham is a practitioner of CMM that gave me this language of changing the moment in the moment. And I just think that makes it, very much in your face. Like it's moment to moment. It's not, okay, look at my watch, 5:00 today, I'll be making better social worlds. Like it's in every single moment. Can be front of mind, that's why I love the language of communication perspective. And my metaphor for that is talking about it like glasses. Like it's a true lens that I feel like I wear. And as a glasses wearer, I need mine all the time. So I feel like I've always got this on, and it's always coloring what I'm experiencing. And I think that's the kind of embodied version of that, is to have that change the moment in the moment perspective, where you're always asking, what are we making? And what's changing the thinking to be, what's the better social world of this moment?
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. I think we have this illusion of stability and linearity, but in reality, we are changing the world right here, right now. What we are talking together is changing me forever. What I'm afterwards is completely influenced by what we're talking. And everything, we just don't realize that. And it's so simple, but at the same time, so profound. Yeah, we should take advantage of that organic way of doing things and be more intentional in what we are doing right now and how it can support and help with a different future.
Yeah, I just kind of have this funny image that I feel like, you know, people maybe leave like a really deep conversation or listening to someone talk, be like, wow, like, you know, leaving like this conversation has changed me forever. The kind of way that you just said it in a like, you know, they're very aware of this, something deep happened or my perspective changed or whatever. But that is like, it just implies all these things for me. But I wonder what would happen if we, you know, used that in more of our day-to-day moments that you know, are checking out at the grocery store and you say to the person, this conversation has changed me forever, because in the social constructionist world, in that moment to moment, everything's a, you know, critical moment where you've got choices. Like, that's true. Maybe it's not true in the way of that other way you would say it, where it's like, I'm deeply and profoundly aware of how I've changed, but every moment, what if we're like, this has changed me? And it has. So it's just acknowledging that. So that was just kind of making me chuckle as I was thinking about that. But thank you
Yeah.
so much for all your time today. And as we wrap up, I'd love to give one last opportunity. If there's anything I didn't ask about or didn't know to ask, anything else that you want to share with us about any of what we've talked about or haven't talked about, or if there's any story that you want to leave us with that's related to this work, not related, important to you. It's a big, wide open invitation to what do you want to leave us with?
I I'm not sure. I want to appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about these topics and appreciate your guidance and your questions and acknowledge that we are creating the future right now. This is meaningful and is leaving me with so many, yeah, thoughts and ideas. Yeah, so just one story that I'm thinking right now that came into my mind when we were talking about how I encounter constructionism is my first years of engaging with the approach of social construction almost made me mute. I became so afraid of saying things because I realized the power of language,
Wow, yeah.
and I got stuck into choosing my words and afraid of saying something that, might have impact that is not intended. So, but over time, I learned, and this is something interesting. Over time, I learned that language has power and is performatory and creates our future, but also it's fluid.
Yeah.
And organic and dynamic. So it's always provisional. So I don't need to be afraid of language because I can always change it.
Yeah.
And I can always unpack and unfold and relate differently and invent new ones. So I thought of this story because for those people start engaging with this understanding of language, do not be afraid of speak your way. By being mindful, be creative and expand the words and create new ones. And it can be a fun play.
Yeah.
Yeah, to engage with, and in the engagement, create new ones. And so that was the story I was thinking about.
Perfect place to end it. So thank you. Thank you for giving us that language. And I know we've, you know, touched on this language of better social worlds. And I feel like almost the whole conversation, that's a frame I'm using of how is this part of our better social worlds? And so I won't kind of have us get into that anymore today, but rather leave that with people as they're listening to reflect for themselves. And, you know, as they make their own definitions of what a better social world is, how are they seeing this work and all these, you know, very complex things we talked about being part of their better social world. So thank you so much again. This conversation has changed me for the rest of my life in a literal way and an emotional, cognitive way. So thank you so much again. And I've just really enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Abbie. I had a great talk today with you.
Good. Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.